One of the characteristics common to all living organisms is that they're composed of cells. Whether they are single-celled organisms like these bacteria or this protist, to the multicellular animals, of which this nervous cell is one cell, to multicellular plants. All living organisms are composed of cells. Now we're going to talk about some general features of cells, but realize that there are many different kinds of cells, each with their own specific functions. However, one thing needs to be made certain. The cell is the most basic unit of life. In other words, the smallest living thing that we can say is alive is the cell. Now, if we were to, for instance, take this protist and take a really close look at it, we would see an amazing amount of complexity inside this one single cell. However, that one single cell is in fact microscopic, really incredibly small. So why is it that cells are so small? The answer has to do with this concept of increasing the surface area to volume ratio. Now this is a common theme in biology, and let me explain it to you now. Say we had a 4-centimeter cube. So in other words, each face of this 6-sided cube is 4 centimeters by 4 centimeters. That would mean that the area of one of these faces is then 16 centimeters squared. And then each of these faces are 16 centimeters squared. So if we had to calculate the total surface area of this 4-centimeter cube, we would add up all those 6 sides, being 16 centimeters squared each, for a grand total of 96 centimeters squared is the surface area. The volume of this cube would just be the length times the width times the height, 4 by 4 by 4, which is 64 cubic centimeters. So the surface area divided by the volume, or the surface area to volume ratio, is 96 to 64, which works its way down to 1.5 to 1. Okay, so now let's say we look at a smaller cube, a 1-centimeter cube. And now each of the 6 faces of this cube is going to be 1 centimeter squared, or 1 by 1. And since there's 6 sides, then the total surface area will be 6 centimeters squared. Now what about the volume? Well, the volume is 1 by 1 by 1, length times width times height, and therefore that's 1 cubic centimeter. So the surface area to volume ratio is 6 to 1. So we see that the smaller cube, in fact, has the greater surface area to volume ratio, 6 to 1, over 1.5 to 1. Now, why is this important? A very good question. The greater surface area to volume ratio afforded by the very small size of cells, it allows a more efficient exchange of nutrients and waste per unit volume. So what we have inside this one cell here is a whole bunch of very complex what are called organelles that we'll talk about in a future video. And they're responsible for processing nutrients and generating waste. Now those nutrients and wastes need to move across the cell membrane. Nutrients come in, wastes leave. And of course, if there's greater surface area, then more nutrients can move in per unit time and more waste can move out. So those organelles are capable of handling these materials in large volumes. The greater surface area per unit volume allows more efficient handling of those materials, and that's why cells are so tiny. So there's another way besides just being very small to increase surface area, and that's to fold up your surface itself. Now, in this way, you greatly increase surface area without increasing volume by very much at all. So take a look at this intestinal cell here, and what you see is the cell membrane folded up on itself over and over and over again all the way around. These little folds in the cell membrane are called microvilli, and we'll be seeing those again as well. Now those microvilli greatly increase the surface area for nutrients and waste. Now, what about that cell membrane? That cell membrane is all folded up there, and we want to take a look at that because that's also a very common feature of all cells. The cell membrane itself is what's called a phospholipid bilayer. We talked about that in the video on lipids. It's composed of these phospholipids, which, if you recall, have a polar phosphate group for a head that interacts with water, hydrophilic, and nonpolar tails that are hydrophobic. And this is the reason why you see these polar heads interacting with the outside and the inside of the cell, where the hydrophobic tails all cluster towards each other in the middle. And we have this double bilayer. Now, what I really want you to focus on here is that this phospholipid bilayer is crammed full of things like proteins and enzymes that help move things across the cell membrane or catalyze reactions, cholesterol, a very important component of cell membranes that give it its structure and hydrophobicity as well, and the carbohydrates also attached to proteins, which are used for cell signaling. So the cell membrane is a very busy place.